The usual narrative goes something like this: Phantasy Star 3 was the worst game in the series. But are the critics right? Phantasy Star 3 was a game I wanted to love, especially since its predecessor was a science fiction classic and arguably one of my favorite games on the Sega Genesis. I still remember when I first heard about the game, which released for the Genesis in 1991. I was blown away by the idea of players following the character through a multi-generational battle. I was able to grind my way through Phantasy Star 3 when I first played it. There were lots of changes in the game mechanics from its predecessor, and I think most people would agree that it was bold in what it tried to do. But the experimentation was only partially successful, which is probably why it's gotten its black sheep status. Over the years, my thoughts on the game have changed a lot, from disappointment to a deeper appreciation of its ambitions. I recently revisited the game and completed all possible routes to see how I feel now. So let's dive in, but just a heads up, there's a bunch of story spoilers. Phantasy Star 3 was developed by a different team from the original two games, and it's apparent in every aspect of the game, from the art style to the character designs. But that's not the full story. The director, S2, was the assistant director on Phantasy Star 2, and if you look at the special things, Rieko Kodama is there too. Kodama was heavily involved with 1 and 2 and would direct 4. So I don't think it's a stretch to think they at least consulted her. Also, change isn't necessarily bad. There's a lot of sequels that have different teams and sometimes they can improve on things. I actually spoke with the composer behind Phantasy Star 3, Ippo, and learned some interesting things about the development which I'll go over later when I talk about the music. In a visual sense, Phantasy Star 3 distinguishes itself from its siblings with more naturalistic portraits, rather than the anime-style panels of other Phantasy Stars, since the developers were aiming for a more realistic take on the series. The opening cinematic is bold and intriguing, framing the battle as an ancient one between Orakio and Laia that took place 1,000 years ago. Orakio harnessed technology to form an army of cyborgs, which was led by his great robot general, Siren. Laia conjured a deadly force of monsters under the guidance of Lune to fight back. Their battles were so brutal, the people who descended from them have remained enemies for 1,000 years. At least that's the story we're told. You start the game playing as an Orakian prince, Reese. He's marrying a mysterious woman named Maya, who, following fantasy tropes, has lost her memory. During the wedding, a lion monster kidnaps her. Reese swears to rescue her and destroy the lions in the process, renewing their ancient conflict. Reese's father outwardly admonishes his son and throws him in the dungeon, but secretly aids him by including equipment and a monitor in the cell. The prince escapes with the help of a stranger, Lena, and then recruits a cyborg called Mew as he begins to uncover the mysteries behind the ancient war and why the two original heroes disappeared. One small note, Mew being a cyborg means that there's an organic component to her originating from a living being. It made me wonder who she was 1,000 years ago, especially since she fights exactly like Nei. This whole opening felt so epic for me, from the wedding to the attack by the lions, all set to dramatic music. It seems like a trope with the princess getting kidnapped, but of course this is a totally different scenario as you figure out what's really going on. To this day, it's by far my favorite opening in the series and probably one of the best of any 16-bit JRPG. Scattered throughout the world are random airfields and cryptic temples, the ruins echoing in the aftermath of that ancient conflict. The whole idea of the game being a traditional fantasy world is quickly dispelled when the party enters one of the tunnels that connect the 7 separate worlds. Reese finds himself in a futuristic corridor with strange circuitry all around. Phantasy Star 3 reveals the origins of its world carefully, crafting together a constellation of whispered rumors and cybernetic anomalies. The theme that evil can sometimes be so powerful that only families working in conjunction with their descendants can overcome is a powerful one. Dispersed throughout the world are survivors of the old conflict. My favorite character in the series, Ren, was introduced in this game. A cyborg whose template is based on the Orakian general Siren. His ability to transform into vehicles is one of the best parts of the game. His Aerojet mode, which lets the party quickly fly from one section to another, should have been available earlier in the quest as it's indispensable. Ren and his counterpart cyborg Mew stay with the party through all 3 generations, acting as an anchor, both from a strength perspective and a narrative one. Think of them as a more badass C-3PO and R2-D2, albeit without the humor. The first generation with Reese is more about the setup of the world as he learns Maya was actually an Orakian, the eternal enemies of the lions who are Reese's people. what we thought was a kidnapping was actually a rescue operation as they saved their princess. It provides context for the characters, gives a sense of the animosity between the Iraqians and Lions, but doesn't answer many of the questions I had. For example, how did Maya get lost and end up at Reese's hometown, Landon, in the first place? Once you finish Reese's quest and find Maya, the game's vaunted generation system first comes into play. You can choose who Reese marries, Maya or Lena, the woman who rescued you earlier. She's actually a princess who was originally supposed to marry Reese, a fact that was lost in the localization. It's the first time in a console game I can recall actually having the option of getting married. The 16-bit era generally didn't have social links or hookups. The fact that the game gave you a choice was pretty mind-blowing, and for that alone, Phantasy Star 3 deserves major props. The problem here is that I didn't get a sense of who either character was, so I didn't feel a connection to either. I still had no idea who Maya was, and as the final boss for the section had me fighting her dad, the King of Sil, I doubted he'd welcome me as his son-in-law. This leads to what I think is the biggest issue with Phantasy Star 3, which is that there's very little relationship building between any of the characters. We barely get a sense of who any of them are. I understand there were memory limitations on the Genesis cartridge, but even a few more lines of dialogue when characters experience events together would have gone a long way to getting a sense of their personality. Like here, there's a long quest involving adjusting the moon's gravitational strength to form a land bridge, but when they cross it, no one even says anything. This has the unfortunate effect of rendering the generational system a lot less impactful, since aside from slight differences in the characters and narrative, there's no need to experience all 4 ancestral lines. I would have loved to have seen Reese struggle more with his choice to live among the lions, since he'd been raised to believe they were the enemy. This would be like if Romeo actually ended up marrying Juliet and lived with her family, but showed no reaction. It's a missed opportunity not to explore that, or to see him impart some of his wisdom to his children and show how the 2 different marriages changed who they were. What would a child growing up sharing the ancestry of the ancient enemies of Laia and Orakio be like versus someone who went back to their home country? As it stands, almost the entire story is situational and plot-driven, rather than being guided by the characters and their decisions, kinda like Reese's opening choice. Of all the generations, the second generation's quest with Niall, Reese's son if he marries Lena, was the best crafted from a story perspective. It starts off with the ancient general Lune, who served with the original Laia 1,000 years ago, returning. He destroys Lena's home and kills Niall's grandfather. Niall rushes to help but finds the castle is in ruins. He has to stop Lune and embarks on a journey to find out the truth behind the Orakian Lion War. On the opposite end, if Reese married Maya, then his son Ayn has him fighting the return of the cyborg army and Orakio's general, Siren. Like Lune, he fought 1,000 years ago. But how is it possible he's back? Despite fighting on opposite sides, the villains both share similar motivations: rage and a desire for revenge for what happened 1,000 years ago when they were both respectively banished. During the quest, you find Laia's pendant, which reveals that it was Dark Force that had corrupted Laia and Orakio, forcing them into a battle between the 2 sides. But in the first of a couple really big reveals, Orakio and Laia, who we thought were eternal enemies, joined forces to fight against this ancient evil. The people of Phantasy Star 3 had been engaged in a perpetual battle based on the machinations of the ancient enemy, Dark Force, who had completely distorted the past. Ayn's journey does have some interesting reveals. His uncle Lyle actively assists the party and reveals to his nephew that he was the one who had kidnapped Maya at the beginning of the game. I was fascinated by this, especially since he joins Reese in the first generation. I feel this revelation would have had much more emotional poignance for Reese to have discovered. He would have been conflicted, forced to either forgive or fight Lyle. By reconciling, it would have been an incredible way of showing how the ancient conflict was finally coming to an end. The way it plays out, Lyle reveals his dragon form to Ayn, who expresses no real reaction. And why would he? Then Lyle passes away and it's on to the next section. Now to be fair, there are some really great moments, like finding Laia's younger sister who's also named Laia, and waking her from a cryogenic sleep to hear her version of history, or how the fight against Lune resolves. You bring Laia's sister with you, and when Lune sees her, it calms him and brings him to his senses. The 1,000-year war is finally at an end. Or if you're fighting against the cyborg general Siren, he retreats when you first beat him, but in the next generation you find him as an old mess, falling apart, feeling guilty about his part in the conflict. Something about seeing the once feared warrior in a frail state, regretting his past, was moving. I just wish they could have done more so that those moments had more meaning. That's the thing that bugs me. There are really good seeds of ideas here for the characters, it's just that they never fully get the chance to germinate. While Phantasy Star 3 struggles in developing its characters, it shines when it comes to weaving together a fascinating science fiction plot. Players eventually learn that the game is connected to the events of Phantasy Star 2 and the tragic destruction of the planet of Parma. In the aftermath of its demise, multiple colony ships escape and roam the stars to find a new home. And I'm not sure why they didn't just hop over to Moda or Dezo, but over 1,000 years later, the people of the colony ship the game takes place on completely forgot that past. I love the implications this had for me as a kid, making me wonder how much of our own history was real and how much of it had been distorted over time. There is a concern in oversimplifying history from a dialectical perspective, framing it as two forces battling against each other. There's usually a far more complex pigmentation to the motivations and politics that drive an age. In PS3, there's an acknowledgement of that complexity as the dialectic is reframed from Orakio and Laia to humanity versus Dark Force. While it doesn't pursue the theoretical implications to a deeper level, it does make us think about how a lot of our own conflicts are based on the beliefs and ideas developed by people who lived more than 1,000 years ago. Would those original figures have wanted so much death and suffering inflicted in their name? While the possibilities of 4 unique generations seems vast, the 3rd generation is more or less the same across the board. The opening movies have different inciting incidents, like in Aaron's opening. He witnesses 2 colony ships attacking each other, and he's sent to investigate what's going on. I also dig his broad shoulder epaulets. Of the 4, Sean has the most dramatic start as the moon he's living on gets blown up by the main colony ship. He barely escapes with his life, but his parents, Ayn and Thea, stay behind and die in the explosion. Despite these different starting points, once the mission gets going for each of them, the goal is the same. Gather the 5 ancient weapons, transform them into the more powerful Ney weapons, then fight Dark Force. I do like how these weapons are tied to famous historical figures in the game like Orakio, but the amount of repeated backtracking players will have to do is really painful, especially if you're doing all 4 timelines like I did. As memory limitations made the implementation of the 4 separate generations difficult, I almost feel that if they cut out 2 of the 4 and focus on making the 2 that remain stronger, the game itself would have been a more rewarding experience. In particular, I really wish the twin siblings of the 3rd generation, Aiden and Gwyn, could have had more development as I love their character designs. This is also the only scenario where we follow a princess. The generation opens with Gwyn having haunting nightmares, but after that, we don't really learn anymore, and I wish the story could have followed up on her journey. The final world, Termina, is mostly a body of water with a huge floating city called La Chute. Rulakir, the brother of Orakio, has been sitting on the throne for 1,000 years. He's been totally twisted and corrupted after losing his family in the war, consumed by hatred. As it turns out, Laia and Orakio work together to actually seal all the gates intentionally, and lock Dark Force underneath the world of Landon. Reese and his descendants were the one who opened up all the gates and unleashed Dark Force on the unsuspecting world. I asked this question about Rolf in Phantasy Star 2 and ask it again in 3. Had my efforts made things worse? Ultimately, whichever generation you choose, you defeat Dark Force and at the same time help connect the divided cities of the world. You learn the extremely powerful Megiddo spell when you initially unleash Dark Force and then use that same magic to destroy the city of La Chute. I think there's something a bit ominous, maybe disturbingly insightful, in the fact that the power you learn from evil is the one you use to vanquish it, at least for 1,000 years. The inhabitants of the colony ship finally know the truth about their past. The hope is that they remain united and not fall back into partisan strife. There are 4 different endings, which again for its time is pretty unique among console RPGs. Each had an interesting take on the future fate of their colony ship. I actually like the time paradox one where they go back to Earth as it makes for a fun nod to the sinister Terran ending of Phantasy Star 2. Overall, despite some complaints, I like this story a lot, especially considering the era it came out in. Games like Star Ocean Till the End of Time and Shin Megami Tensei 4 would follow on that idea of starting in a medieval world, only to discover that there's a whole different sci-fi world out there, but PS3 was one of the first to do it on consoles. In terms of just pure plot, I think it's as strong as 2 was and slightly better than 4. And let me clarify that 4 had way better execution and presentation, and really awesome characters. but 3 tried to do some really incredible things with its narrative within a limited space. Unfortunately, the story isn't reinforced by the world art within Phantasy Star 3. The environments feel very similar to one another. The dungeons are repetitive, breaking down into 2 motifs: red-floored caves and the previously mentioned corridors connecting the worlds, which are made up entirely of glass floors. These you can even skip once you get the Laya pendant, which lets you warp between worlds. It would have been nice for the other worlds to have had a more distinct visual theme as well. 2 of them are suffering Arctic temperatures. There is also a desert world, but aside from that, there doesn't seem to be any design or planning for the 7 colony worlds. If they had been formed in a way that tied them in with their previous functions as a colony ship, say one planet specializes in producing monsters from a biolab, and another specifically controls food production, I think that would have given them more meaning. Even the final world looks the same as the others. If the entire sphere was full of ancient ruins that had been destroyed during a past war, without a single word, players would have had a sense of how grave the stakes were. The absence of aesthetic differences between the towns for each area is a huge missed opportunity as well. Whether you're visiting a Lion or Iraqian town, they share the same architect. Even from grandfather to grandson, the buildings never change with time. The cyborg city inhabited solely by artificial life looks the exact same as human ones. On the positive, I do like the bestiary of monsters and robots. They're unlike enemies I've seen in any other RPG of that time. I like the giant towering titans, the bladed warriors, and more. I also love the fact that depending on which generation you play as, you'll face different enemies related to the storyline, like the robots under Siren or monsters under Loon. The battle system feels like a step down from 2. Sometimes games that are sparse in story can make up for that weakness with really good combat that gives players a feel for who their team members are through the way they fight. Phantasy Star 3 gets rid of all character animations and replaces them with symbolic stripes. Rather than seeing your party attack enemies, all you see are lines representing that attack. I think the goal was to streamline fighting and make it fast-paced, but the effect was disappointing and made me feel disconnected from the battles so that they got repetitive. You might counter RPGs like Dragon Quest do the same, and that's true, but I think the problem is that Phantasy Star 2 had already set a higher standard, so it's hard to go back after that. At least battles can be automated and the visual icons are pretty nifty as explained in the manual. Also, in theory, you can adjust your different techniques to emphasize certain specialties, giving some variation on the fighting style. The battles are easier overall, but there's still way too many random encounters. One thing I think that's agreed by most gamers as being awesome is the soundtrack by Ippo. She only had a month to compose the entire soundtrack and had to also learn the Sega proprietary tool, Prelude, during that time. As she told me, if the director likes it, I started making data for Mega Drive, but you can't use data from Prelude directly on the Mega Drive. You have to convert the SMF data into Mega Drive sound data, then you make revisions. During these revisions, I had to try and optimize the sound to utilize the least amount of data possible. The soundtrack dynamically adjusts itself depending on how many members you've recruited. The lonely overworld theme becomes a robust song of hope as your numbers grow. I also like how if there's only one member that's alive or your main character is dead, there's a desperate track that plays. Battle music also shifts depending on the flow of the fight, with a more dreadful theme playing when monsters seem prevalent, to a more optimistic beat as your members gain the upper hand. Also, a detail that I really loved was that when you initially enter the lion town of Shishoran, the villagers are in hiding and the music is ominous since you think they're your enemies. But if you return later in the story when you've opened things up, the normal town song plays. The OST in general is fantastic, and that dungeon theme is one of my favorites. Ippo revealed that the dynamic music system that changed with the flow of battle and the number of party members took some trial and error. That was Mr. S, the director's idea. He does not make his name public, so I just call him S. In the staff role of the game, he is credited as S2. When he told me that he'd like the music to change, I thought, he has a fresh idea. At the same time, I wondered how I should do it and deal with the sound data. Mr. S has a vast knowledge of music, so he had a clear idea how he wanted the music of Phantasy Star 3 to be and explained it to me. Since both of us love classical music, it was easy for us to share ideas. At first, I was asked to have the music change depending on who was in the party, rather than the number of members. But there were problems, like there were too many types of characters who can join the party, and if all the characters have their own unique music, the game wouldn't work in the later stages as it took up too much memory, so we had to give up that idea. As for the music in the battle sequences, she states, I think I could have done more to link the music in better ways, and I could have used more musical patterns. Yeah, I have some regrets. If I were to do Phantasy Star 3 music now, I would think too much and it would take so much more time than I did back then. Her regret at not having had more time makes me wonder what the entire team could have done if they'd had just a few more months. She showed what was possible with more time in the incredible OST for Phantasy Star 4, but what also caught my attention was her comment about the memory limitations. Even without the music changing per character, they probably reached the limit of what they could put on the cartridge. I think it explains why parts of the game feel incomplete. I've included a link to the full interview with the composer Ippo down below. She had some really interesting things to say about the series as a whole, and I might actually do an updated Phantasy Star 4 video with what she shared about the development of that game. I can't believe it's been decades since I first played Phantasy Star 3. I was only a kid then, and now I have my own kid. So I think about Reese's journey, how he set off on what seemed a straightforward mission to save his fiancée, but that ended up having a massive impact that went way beyond his life and even affected his grandchildren. One of the game's most important lessons is an obvious one. Our actions have consequences we might not even imagine, impacting generations to come. Does the game have problems? Yes. Are the critics right to call it the black sheep of the series? Mostly. Do the characters move too slow? Without a doubt. But do I still love it? Absolutely. Thank you so much for watching this entire retrospective. I used a bunch of the art and maps from the cool hint book that came separately from the game and recommend checking it out. Also, if you like this video, make sure to check out my other Phantasy Star reviews, which I'll link at the end. There's a few other RPG retrospectives I'm working on, so please either subscribe or stop on by, and I'll see you all next time.